Привет, меня зовут Станислав, вы на канале сФилином. Это интервью снял немец. Он попросил скрыть его лицо, по разным причинам. Интервью, конечно, на английском. Если вы хотите услышать автоперевод от Яндекса, откройте это видео через Яндекс браузер. Легко и просто, вот и все. А так, это видео на английском с субтитрами. Приятного вам просмотра.
Привет and hello to the Why Russia podcast. In this podcast, we ask foreigners who live in Russia one simple question. Why Russia? Today, we are connected with Stan. He's not a foreigner, he's a Russian, but he came back after living many years in the West, as far as I know, in Canada and in the US. So Stan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your journey, and maybe you can tell us also what motivated you to move back to Russia after living so many years in Western countries.
Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast, Thomas. And to everyone listening, hi, my name is Stan. I have a channel on YouTube. I have a couple, one of them I stopped really putting things out because just don't have the time. So mainly I have my Russian-speaking channel, and the English-speaking channel is the one that I haven't been really updating quite as much as I should have. To answer that question as to like what motivated me back, and we can expand on that later after the journey question's answered, one of the biggest reasons is family. Most of my family, actually all of my family, lives in Russia. So it is family, because when you live far away from everyone, literally every single member of your family, and you're meeting them on Skype or seeing them once a year, then you're missing out on all of the interesting events that happen. And then you just kind of see your family get older, because our lives are finite, and every time I saw them and they were getting older, I felt bad, and every time I would have to leave for another long period of time, I also felt bad, like any normal human being would. So in the end, it is family. The second reason would be also quite family oriented. I do not, with the way things are going in the West, I would not want to raise, and I'm talking about the US and Canada and some Western European countries as well, I wouldn't want to raise my kids in those countries. I have a child, and I do not see any kind of normal future with the way things are going for any kid that's born or has moved to those countries with, if we're going to talk about third wave feminism, if we're going to talk about alphabet mafia propaganda and how it's instilled into children, like, do what you want to do if it's legal behind closed doors in your bedroom, but stay the hell away from my kids. Those are my kids, and I want them to be raised in a normal society, and not a society where the 0.0 something of a percent dictates on how my children should live or view the world. That's not something that I want to have my kids grow up in. Third, of course, there is opportunity in countries that actually are not established but are establishing themselves, or maybe that's not the right word, but in areas where there needs to be development and needs to be work, there's always opportunity. So when you're living in a Western countries that mostly has been established and the market has been divided by a variety of different large companies that eat up smaller businesses, the opportunity decreases. Whereas in countries where this hasn't happened yet, the up and coming, the so-called third world countries, there's a lot more opportunity that's available. Same thing with the opportunity is that I speak 3 languages, 2 of them fluently. I also speak French, but I'm losing it because I'm not speaking French with anyone really. And in this case, like my language has not been needed at all, my Russian language, in Canada or in the US. Whereas in living in Europe, a person who, and I met many people who literally, like most people that I know, actually speak at least 2 languages. So it would be like English and Maltese English and Italian English and French, Spanish English and other languages. Like, languages here are much more appreciated, and anyone who's able to speak more than the local language is an asset, rather than in in the US and in Canada. Of course, there's the local divide between French and English in Canada, and then Spanish and English in the US. But other than that, like if you're not a Spanish or a French speaker, your opportunities dwindle. And in fact, in Quebec, if you don't speak French, or you speak it poorly, or you don't have a French last name, you're going to have it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to be able to make something of yourself as a man in business, because there is that discrimination. Even there is systemic discrimination in Quebec against anyone who's speaking English based on the legislation that they have, where, for example, businesses have to display the signage outside, 50% of that signage, or the French has to be 50% bigger than the English, for example. Irish pubs were raided because they had too many English lettering and paintings with English words on it. I mean, an Italian place got raided. It's called Pastagate, where they were told by the actual language police, yep, such a thing exists in Quebec, actual language police. They have a specific list of words in English that you can use. And they raided them because they were using pasta on their menu rather than pâte alimentaire. Or another situation was in Quebec City, where they actually ham and cheese had to be, grilled cheese was afterwards the official English term that you could use, but they had a legislative issue with a company using grilled cheese because it was in English. But besides that, there's different types of, so for example, in some schools, they were, whether on a legislative level or just teachers and everything like that, were telling kids that they could only speak French during recess. They couldn't speak their own languages. There's a big linguistic issue in Canada between the province of Quebec and other provinces. So, I mean, there are many different types of reasons. I would say these are the majority. These are the main ones. The main one is definitely family, and then raising kids. But as far as my story, I mean, just like many Russian families, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and it is one of the greatest tragedies for Russians and the Russian-speaking population, not because it was, we're all crazy communists here. No, not at all. It's because millions of people all of a sudden became homeless, in the sense that they lost their home. They lost Russia. They lost it. They had to live in other countries, and in some Baltic states, they still have the gray passport, where it's basically you're neither a citizen of that country, or you're not a citizen of Russia. I mean, you are Russian. You've been living there. Your family's been living there for tens of years, if not more, generations, and you're not really allowed to be who you are. In this case, there's still that discrimination still exists, and it's becoming worse in those areas. So during that time, many Russians moved out of Russia because crime was at an all-time high. Opportunities were given to those who were okay with morally breaking the law. And I'm exaggerating here, of course, and I'm generalizing, but you could say there were millions of dollars just laying out on the streets, not physically, but, you weren't allowed to have a business in the Soviet Union. And in this case, you could open one up, but all of a sudden you'd have all these mafia people come up and offer you protection. There's a lot of racketeering, murder, again, drugs, alcohol, plus lots of propaganda telling you to move out. The country was falling apart economically, socioeconomically. At one point, there was not enough physical money in circulation, where cities had to barter between each other. If one was producing buses and the other was producing something else, they would exchange. There was a civil war happening in the south. A lot of problems. So Russians were moving out. Our family moved out to Europe, to Malta, and then made our way into Canada, and then I studied in the US. And then my family actually moved back. So in this case, my journey has been Russia, Malta, Canada, US, Canada, and then back to Malta for 3 years, where I did my master's, MBA. And then afterwards, my long-term goal has been to move back to Russia. It's just there was a stop midway in Malta, you could say, where I got married and took my family. And now we live in Moscow, Russia.
So you moved out of Russia as a young child, if I understand correctly, with your family already, and then you were growing up.
That's correct. I was 6 years old when we moved out.
Okay. So how do you believe your experience living in the West shapes your perspective of Russia? And did your view of the West change over the years?
Well, how has my perspective changed because I lived? Well, the thing is, I've basically developed an immunity to some types of propaganda that's still being spewed upon Russian speakers, where everything in the West is perfect. There are no problems. You immigrate and instantly you become a well-off person. There are opportunities laying everywhere. There's no discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. So that was instilled for years into people living in Russia, and I've developed an immunity to it because of my experience living there. Because I have seen discrimination, I have seen violence, I have seen crime, I have seen alcoholism and drugs and missed opportunities. So I know that. I'm not saying that those countries are bad to live in. What I'm saying is that they are normal countries with normal problems that exist almost anywhere on the planet. Some a little bit better, some a little bit worse. But there's nobody here in Russia that could come up to me, especially people that actually never lived outside of Russia, and tell me, well, it's better out in the West because there's no racism. Bullshit. It's better in the West because everyone's rich. Bullshit. I know that for a fact that there are people who struggle. There are many people, millions of people who live paycheck to paycheck, millions of people struggling. In no way am I, like some people think that I'm shitting on those countries. No, in fact, usually if I speak to a Canadian or an American and we have this discussion, there's an agreement. We agree with each other that these problems exist. We agree that rich people exist. There are opportunities as well, just like there are in Russia. But the Russian population, and again, I'm generalizing here, but there are those people that still believe that everything in the West is just perfect and everyone is living in this fantasy land where everything is absolutely perfect, when I know by my experience and statistically and from research that is absolutely not the case. So as far as it's influenced me, I mean, I've had, it's good to travel. It opens you up to a different type of view. You get to communicate with different types of people, and it helps you shape your own worldview and a better understanding. But it is my belief, and I truly believe this, that only when a person actually realizes that there are problems, similar problems existing in other countries, that person stop pissing in the elevator and stop ruining their own alcove and their own corridor just because they think, well, I'm moving out of here. That's my goal. I want to leave because everything is better over there. But as far as, one of the biggest influences it has is on me is that I worked in low paying jobs. I rented cars for car rental companies. I worked in a retail outlet. I've done those kinds of jobs. I did I did kind of a bit of demolition, just a tiny bit, which is really hard labor, and moving as well, just a little tiny bit. So I know those jobs. And when I see people in Russia from Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, when I see them doing these exact same jobs, I feel for them because I know what it feels like, and I'm nice to these people, unlike some of my compatriots, because they have a different view upon these things because they've never been in that position. So actually, I used to say, and I should probably say this more often, that if anyone wants to know what it feels like to live in another country, just go to a Russian speaker, for example, or a Russian person living in Russia. Go work those menial jobs with those immigrants from Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and then you'll soon realize that, this is what you'll be, at least in the beginning, or maybe forever, because not everyone gets presented that great opportunity. A friend of mine, for example, his family, they got ruined because of immigration. They might have, and again, depending on how much perseverance they have or had, they might have been much, much better off just staying in Russia. But, one was an engineer, couldn't get a job. No one really cared about his ability and his knowledge, and he didn't have the will to work in a menial job like cashier at McDonald's, so he died from alcohol-related problems. Same thing for his wife. They were living on welfare, and their son didn't really have a good childhood, in my opinion, or at least, good young adulthood, if you want to call it that, because he was supporting his family. He was even offered a job as a manager in a restaurant chain in Russia a while back, but he chose not to go. If he went, I don't know what would have been with his family. So he has a lot of courage and strength still to this day. I know that, but I still believe that entirely ruined his life. So in this case, in this case, how it's influenced me positively, because I've tried to take all the positive aspects of living there and applied it to myself in this case.
You mentioned something very interesting, that many Russians have a very positive view of the US, especially, and maybe also Western Europe. And this was one of the reasons why I started doing this podcast, because when I lived in Moscow, people always asked me, why Russia? Thomas, why Russia? Of course, they were not speaking in this accent, but they were always asking me if I'm kind of maniac coming to Russia and not enjoying the milk and honey that was coming to the Western countries. So do you believe now the perception of the West is changing inside of Russia, or is it still like that most people, if they have the chance, if they would get the chance to emigrate to those countries, they would maybe use this chance?
Well, actually, that's a good question. I see that it's changing, especially from when I started my YouTube channel. I see a lot of, first of all, there are a lot of people that have actually moved back than I had imagined. That's the first thing. And there are lots of people, a lot of people here who don't hold this view anymore. I believe that every day there are more and more of those people because of the ability to access different types of information. Before, access to that information was restricted or not available. And now, I mean, there are more people who have a simple understanding of English, or they can use translators and stuff like that to look at different news and what these news say about them, to look at the different news outlets and what they say about their own countries. So of course there are those people still, and anyone who's lived elsewhere outside of Russia, we encounter those people all the time. And like, why the hell did you come back? Like, why? Even there's a famous case with Jordan Peterson when he went to go to Russia because Western medicine in the US and Canada couldn't help him at all. In fact, they made his case worse. And he went, and this is his story, I believe it was his daughter or he was telling it, that when he was put into a special clinic, the first thing the nurse had asked him was, why did you choose to come here? Or like, did you choose to come here to die, or something to that effect? I can't remember the exact words used. But even that mentality really irritates me, is that based on previous events and propaganda, some people don't value everything that this country has to offer, that my country has to offer to them. And the other point is, and I guess that comes from, we experience ups and downs in our daily lives. I mean, Thomas, have you ever woken up and just, it doesn't have to be Monday, it could be Friday. It's sunny outside. Everything is perfect. You've had a fantastic breakfast. Everyone around you is happy to see you, but you still feel like you've not accomplished anything. You still feel like crap. You feel like you're worthless. Have you had those feelings before?
Of course. I guess everybody had those feelings, right?
Yeah. I've had those feelings in Canada, in the US, in Malta. I had those same feelings in Russia. Now imagine a person who's been fed this propaganda that everything is better out west and they don't know any better, and they wake up with those same feelings. I mean, what's the first thing that comes to mind besides, hey, I want to move out because apparently it's better over there? They don't know that people experience these exact same feelings whilst living out in Western countries, because it's normal. Unfortunately, it's the struggle of life that everyone goes through. So there are people who still believe that everything is better and there are no problems out west, but I see that the amount of people who view their own country, Russian speakers, positively, I see that amount increasing.
You have a quite successful YouTube channel where you interview other Russians who moved back from Western countries, especially back to Russia. So would you say this is a mass movement in some respect, or do you think most of these interviews is like anecdotal evidence? And what did you learn from their perspectives? Were the reasons for coming back to Russia basically the same reasons that you had, or is it quite diverse?
Okay, so let's start off with the reasons first, because that's a simple question. Well, I guess it can be complicated, but family is one of them. People were sold this idea and they realize that that's false. So there's always that feeling that you were lied to. You thought you were buying a Mercedes, but instead you got an Opel. You know what I mean? You were being sold a Mercedes quality car, but you got an Opel instead, and you're like, what the hell? You told me this was a Mercedes. I can get the same. Like, do you see what I mean? Do you see the analogy? So, but some of the reasons is, of course, family, the anti-nuclear family propaganda, the fact that for whatever stupid reason, men are supposed to be feminine and women are supposed to be masculine in the West. And there are many people who don't agree with that. Many people. But when you have the media, when you have Hollywood, when you have the government forcing this idea down your throat, and if you speak out against it, you are potentially going to be ostracized or excommunicated from the community in every way, shape, and form, then of course you'll stay quiet. And even though there are families that are saying, no, we're sick of this, they're publicly speaking about it. There's still many cases of drag queen story hour, and recently a dean was showcasing sex toys to kids, and the school defended him and asked people not to go on conservative news outlets to tell them about the story. You're thinking, like, what the hell? You're defending somebody who's showing sex toys to kids? What is wrong with you? Why is this not shut down instantly? Why is that family-oriented drag queen story hour or whatever marketed as family friendly to all ages, where they're really showcasing some grotesque things, and then the media outlets are concentrating on people who are protesting against it, saying, no, don't touch our kids? Like, why is that side being defended when it's clearly, and I'm not saying, I'm not a religious person, not at all, but this seems like Satan's work, and I'm literally not religious, but that's Satan's work, literally. And it should be shut down instantly, but it's not. It's tolerated. So people are moving back for family-oriented reasons. I feel like that's one of the cases. Nostalgia, of course, and obviously Russia is getting a lot better for regular people. We can discard some particular events, like, the I'm not going to name the crisis with the disease that happened recently because of potential blocking, whatever it may be. Obviously, this ongoing special military operation or war has had an effect, obviously, but there's a problem happening worldwide. In fact, there was an oncoming recession in 2019 by a lot of different statistics and factors, even before the medical crisis that was happening. So the medical crisis also had an effect where people were like, wow, we're being told to do a lot of things that we don't want to do. And they decided to move out of those Western countries. And in Russia, we had restrictions as well, but not nearly as punitive or restrictive as they were in the West. So that's the answer to the second part of the question. I believe the first part of the question was, if you don't mind, could you rephrase it again?
Yes, I wanted to ask you if it's a mass movement, would you say, the people moving back to Russia, or is it more like anecdotal evidence?
Okay. So this question is a little bit more difficult to answer because you can't look at a particular year and say, well, this is how it is. You have to look at migration by years. And if you look from the 90s till now, the amount of people leaving Russia, and 2022 was a special year, obviously, because of the conflict, and any conflict anywhere has this effect where people start moving out. But in general, the trend was people were leaving Russia less and less, and actually people coming back was increasing. The trend was increasing. If you look at the actual trend line, that's the important thing to look at, not in one particular year. But with immigration, the reason why it's a bit of a difficult question to answer is that when you immigrate somewhere, okay, you invest money because you've sold your apartment or you sold your business or, flights, lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. So you've invested this money, and moving back for some people means they've lost a lot of money during this process and they can't buy back the apartment that they had and they've burned their bridges. So some people who want to move back, for example, won't do it because they've burned their bridges. They have nowhere to go to. Some people can't move back because they moved together. Now they're divorced, and then kids are living in U.S. and Canada, and their wife has remarried. They don't want to move back. They want to move back, but they can't because then they would not be able to see their kids on a daily or weekly basis. There are people who are neck deep in credit, and they can't. They're not allowed to literally move back, because they have to pay off this debt, and this debt will either be paid off in 20, 30 years or perhaps never. There are those people that have moved back and they want to move back, but they can't because they've already kind of semi-assimilated, and I don't believe anyone wants to say, hey, I've made a little bit of myself. I'm in some kind of job, I have my driver license and I've studied and everything. Let me start from scratch. Like, no one really wants to start from zero. And in fact, when you're immigrating back, you're re-immigrating. So you have that fear of, will I find a job? Will I be successful? Because you have that fear that you might lose something that you've worked so hard to get. Okay? And I feel like that fear doesn't really exist when people are moving out, because they have all these hopes and dreams. So they're like, well, I'll definitely make it. I'll definitely be better. Everything will definitely work out. But when it comes to re-immigration, there are these kinds of issues on people's minds. So I personally, like I mentioned earlier, I didn't think there were that many people who have moved back, and I didn't think that there would be that many people that want to move back. As far as, is it a mass thing? Mass immigration happens when there's a big issue in a particular country: civil war, famine, war, economic collapse, those kinds of factors. So as far as on a mass scale, I wouldn't say so. I don't think it's happening on a mass level, but there is a large increase in the demand for consulting services for people who are looking to move back, because laws have changed. It became easier in some aspects. It became harder in other aspects. So it's quite difficult to be able to answer that question correctly. I can only assume things based on what I've seen. And what I've seen is that there is an increase in interest in moving back, even in 2022. Now, people do comment and they say, well, there's a lot of people that moved out, and there's only, a fraction of those people who are moving back. So, well, that means the people that moved out must be right. But that's incorrect. And incorrect because we all in our lives have been lied to. We've all in our lives have made mistakes, have believed something that is not real and not true. We've been scammed. And I'm not saying that immigration all in all is a scam, but we have to understand that the US and Canada, and I'm specifically talking about those countries because I know their stats, the fertility rate, or I think it's called the fertility rate, where it has to be above 2.1 to be able to sustain a society and to increase and have et cetera, et cetera. Those countries haven't been reproducing. I think Canada since the 70s, or the US since the 70s, they've been reproducing, but not to the point where they can increase the population of their societies and increase wealth and etc. So they have to, one from the 70s or the 80s, one from the 90s or 2000s. Honestly, I can't remember the stats exactly. So in this case, they need immigrants to work those low-skilled jobs. They need immigrants to sell their apartments and their houses and bring that money over and have that direct investment. So they will market themselves as absolutely the best. They will propaganda. They will send this message from all the news outlets and everything, because this is what they need to survive. And they create special programs to attract these people. And once they land, once they're hooked because of credit or family or whatever, then who cares? They're on their own. But yeah, so I think that would be a very long-winded answer to your question, is that there are people who want to move back. There are people who are moving back, but there are also people who are moving out. But again, I believe 200,000, according to German statistics, of Germans move out annually, something like that, for economic reasons. There are people who want to move out of Canada into the US. There are people moving out of the US. There are people moving out of Malta, millennials, something like 30 or 40%, I can't remember the most recent stats, have said that they want to move out based on a variety of different factors. So it is in our nature, fortunately or unfortunately, to want to be able to move, progress, to go somewhere. And immigration is like one of those things. So we'll have to, I guess, wait and see where this goes.
And we live in a great time in this respect, that we can choose freely, basically, where we want to live, what values fit us best, and so on. It's not like in the Soviet Union where the borders are closed, or the borders are also not closed in the US or in Western Europe. So everybody can choose for themselves which country fits their values the best, and so on. This is great. So you conducted hundreds of hours of interviews of Russians who moved back. And what you mentioned as the first reason for many of them is they are not happy how the West is changing. So my question is, why do you think Russians are especially skeptical about the process of the West, how the West is changing? What makes them so skeptical about this change?
Well, I mean, Russians are skeptical of the West in general. I mean, some people who lived in the Soviet Union now are realizing, We weren't told lies about life in the West. It actually is this way. We're also skeptical because of the constant lies. We know our history. We know that our country has been constantly attacked. We know that we've had to defend with millions of people, and millions of people have lost their lives defending our country. And in this case, if it was the Soviet Union, it was a variety of countries in it who had to participate to be able to defend themselves. But as far as like skepticism, we see the lies, we see the hypocrisy. We don't like it. We don't like that our interests are set aside. We don't like being talked to like we're inferior. So that's where the skepticism comes from. I may be wrong. There may be other sources of the skepticism. But as far as where the West is going, like I mentioned before, I don't want my daughter to go into kindergarten or into school, okay, where a purple-haired, half-bald teacher that doesn't look like a man and doesn't look like a woman is telling my daughter that it's okay to think to want to become a man. No. I don't want. Those people can live with their own lives the way they want to live. That's fine. And in Russia, they exist. Go to St. Petersburg. Go walk around for a day. You'll see what I'm talking about. Those people do exist. That's okay. That's fine. But don't tell my kids that they should live like 0.018 or somewhat % of the world lives. Don't tell my kids that it is perfectly fine that a man dressed as a woman is standing in a church reading a story to kids and screaming at the top of his lungs, "Isn't it great to be like me? Would you like to be like me in the future?" I have this video. This was done. And there are many examples of this happening. Now, if these people want to live the way they want to live, that's perfectly fine. I'm not asking for anyone at all to discriminate. What I'm saying is leave my kids the hell alone. And I sincerely believe that many Russians share the exact same feeling. We see that a society historically breaks down when moral values also break down, when there is moral decay. And we see this. It's unfortunate that this is happening to people, but I don't care of what happens in other countries. If they want to live this way, if they want to believe that men can be women and women can be men, if they want to believe that, I can't even say this word properly because I don't want you banned or my channel get removed, but kid diddlers. I don't want kid diddlers normalized, which is in some areas it's happening. They're calling it a sexual orientation. No, there's no way I'm accepting. I'm living in a society that's trying to push kid diddling as a normal everyday occurrence. No, I say no, and I'm putting my foot down. And I will, other people in other countries can fight for their rights to have a nuclear family where it's a healthy household. That's their fight. That's not my fight. My fight is here. I want to make sure that doesn't come to my country and create a whole bunch of unhappy 45-year-old women who regret that they didn't have kids because that's actually where their true happiness stems from and not a career. They want to have a career, fine, but I don't want that. I don't want to see effeminate men walking around who scream at the sight of a cockroach and then, because that really messes things up in society. That really screws things up.
I have another point to add. Maybe you can tell me if this is correct or wrong. Why Russians are quite skeptical about societal engineering, because a lot of Russians were growing up in a society that was also socially engineered, right? The Soviet Union, especially the early Soviet Union, was quite progressive. They were telling women, you have to work, you have to drive the tractor, and so on. So maybe that's why Russians have some kind of immunity against social engineering projects. They just want to grill sometimes, right? They don't want to let the government make such experiments on a large scale. Is this correct, or am I completely wrong about this?
Well, no, there is that thought that the Soviet Union was a big social experiment, and Russians were victims of it. And it's interesting that the world thinks that, Russians are communists, and we love. There are people that are fully for it, and there was a commentator on my channel that was like, "Oh, he was calling me greedy." I'm saying, no, I earned that money, I worked for it, I'm supporting my family. There's no way in hell I want somebody to come in and take a big portion of that money and give it to the alcoholic down the street because he chose to sleep in. He chose to drink alcohol and ruin his life. I don't want to pay for his problems. I understand that there has to be social cushions for people who lose jobs. I understand that, of course, there has to be maternity leave, et cetera, But there is no way I want someone coming in and saying, well, you know what? The apartment you live in is a bit too big. Let's cut it in half and give half of it to somebody else because it's fair. No. If I worked for it, it's mine. And it's my family's, and I'm going to support my family. And if I want to be able to give to a charity, I will give to a charity, and I've done that. But there's no way, but as far as social engineering goes, yeah, there was an experiment, and that experiment was communism. And it wasn't brought to Russians by, it's not a Russian invention, okay? But we were part of that social experiment. Some people liked it, some people don't. Some people have nostalgic feelings about their youth, and that's what they remember. And they're like, life was easier back then. In some cases, it may have been. You graduated, you could find this particular line of work in any city, apparently. That's what I'm being told. There were, the problem is the government was in everything, like literally everything. So, there's a reason why our auto industry was lagging behind the American, the European auto industry. Hell, we were still producing the 2107, the Lada. I think they stopped production in 2011. I think it was 2011. The Lada Classic, whatever. That's a 40-year-old car, technically speaking, with little bits of modification here and there. So the government shouldn't actually be in every single aspect of your life. They should provide healthcare, and allow private as well. They should protect you from disorganized and organized crime. They should protect you when it comes to any kind of foreign invasions, et cetera, but they shouldn't dictate how I run my business. If I'm not dealing illicit things that harm other people, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, if I want to open up a coffee shop, if I want to open up a consulting firm, if I want to have a normal kind of business, they shouldn't be dictating what I should or shouldn't do in this case. That's my own personal view. Now, did I answer your question or did I stray?
Yes. No, you answered the question very nicely. We covered already a lot of ground. Maybe to come to the last question already. Maybe now it's very difficult for Russians who want to move back to Russia because of the sanctions, right? It's difficult to send money between different countries and so on. So the last question, what would be your advice to Russians living abroad who are considering moving back to Russia now?
There's a reason why on my YouTube channel, I don't work with immigration consultants. And I don't work with them because I don't want my message to be not convoluted. I don't want my message to be tied to, he's selling this because he's working with immigration consultants. There's a specific word for it. I can't remember it now. It's left my mind. But I don't want to do that. I'm not here giving advice to people. I can have my own personal opinion. And in this case, you have to really analyze why you're moving. What's the reason? If you're moving to establish a family, if you're moving to live and to try and look into the future and really root yourself here so that in several generations, you will have that wealth. You will have those kids and grandkids, kids, etc. If you agree morally with society here, okay, if you have those nostalgic feelings, but you're able to generate wealth for yourself, okay, because that's a big issue for people who want to move back, is they don't know whether they're going to have a proper paying job or not. They don't know. They see that in dollar amount salaries are lower here, but cost of living is lower in a lot of aspects, so they have to really weigh it properly. It's a lot more difficult to do this. It's easier to just say, they're being paid more in other countries, but you don't understand. People don't understand always that cost of living is also more expensive. You can't earn a lot of money and have very little costs. That doesn't happen. It's impossible. You have to pay people salaries and rents and electricity bills and heating, etc., etc. So my advice is that people really need to understand why they want to do this, what is their reason, and if they will be successful upon coming here. Because if somebody who is in their 40s or 50s and they've kind of established themselves and they want to move back and they don't have a plan to make money on their own or retire somehow with some kind of savings, then it may be difficult for them to get a job. Because let's face it, this is reality. As you get older, if you haven't really established yourself as a knowledgeable person with a lot of experience and you can't provide value to someone, if you're just an average person, with age, you're going to have more difficulty looking for work. I mean, this is normal in Canada. This is normal in the US. I don't know if this is the same in Germany or not, but you're nodding your head. Is it the same in Germany?
It's the same, of course. You need the skill set and so on. You
Yeah.
need to develop your career quite early. So I said it's the last question, but I still have one little question. One more.
All right,
Yes.
go ahead.
I have one little question, the last question, this time for real. Do you think Russia should be open to foreigners, not just Russians moving back, but also other people coming to Russia, maybe because they see also quite a negative development, maybe in the West or something like that? Should Russia be open? Should Russia try to attract those people? Or should Russia stay close, but because maybe those people bring the ideology from the West to Russia as well? What is your opinion here?
Well, my opinion is that there is a global battle for the mind of every person. Whether it's there's a global battle for immigrants, because resources are finite. You don't just get created from thin. Well, in case of fractional reserve banking, they kind of do get created from thin air, technically speaking. But if a person shares the same values, if a person shares the same ideals, then I see no problem with them coming here. I think the problem that they will face, I don't think I know the problem that they will face, has to do with legislation. Because even though Russia is a country that takes in, I think it's second or third, or I think it's third maybe in the world for the amount of immigrants it takes in. But the immigrants are coming from Central Asian countries who used to be part of the Soviet Union. For those people coming in with entirely separate documents, legislation has to get better to be able to accommodate people coming in, because some people don't share this idea. Some people think that, hey, you know what, we don't want those people here. Just like people in Germany and in Canada and the US, they share the same feelings. But if we want to remain competitive, and we want other ideas that would benefit us as a society, we have to be open to people who wish to immigrate and wish to move. Of course, the people that are moving have to realize that they shouldn't dictate when they move. They shouldn't have their noses up in the air and say, well, my society was like that. I'm here now. Thank you. But now you have to change to accommodate me. Okay? I understand legislation-wise, that makes sense. Like if you're inspecting documents, there has to be some kind of easier procedure. And it's getting better. It is getting better. I know it for a fact. It's getting a lot easier to do this. But Russia hasn't been, in this case, historically, sometimes it has been, like during the beginning of communist years when U.S. was in a depression and there were people coming from the U.S. to work and settle in Soviet Russia. That did happen. But as far as modern Russia, we're just starting to kind of see that wave of other people moving from Western countries. I mean, we have a family from Australia, for example. Sabrina and her family, they're living in Central Russia. We have an American farmer living in Central Russia. We have a British farmer living in, not Central, I think he's more out west. So we have these people coming in. Long story short, if you can contribute to society, if you share the same moral values, okay, if you're not a criminal, I don't see why not. I think it only benefits. Okay, I'm not talking about refugees. I'm talking like Europe type refugees, where I'm coming in because of the great economic benefits, and I don't care about any locals, and screw yourselves. Screw you. I'm gonna make sure legislation benefits me only. I'm not talking about those kind of refugees or migrants. I'm talking about people who genuinely can bring value to society. I don't care what skin color they are. I don't care what nationality they are. So the Soviet Union took in many people from Africa who studied in universities here for free, I believe, doctors and other professions. And we still do. I mean, I was surprised at the amount of African nationalities I see here. And, if they can contribute, if they provide value, why not?
Stanislav, thank you very much for your time and your expertise built on the hours that you spent talking to other Russians who remigrated to Russia. And you mentioned the Australian farmer. He will be the next guest on my podcast. So maybe the people, they can tune in again. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you to your listeners and your subscribers. I hope you enjoy this conversation. If you want to check out my YouTube channel, I believe any links will be in the description somewhere. Go ahead, take a look at it. The English channel is kind of dead in the water, but the Russian one, at least you can have some kind of auto translation. Maybe you can understand some things. So again, thank you very much, and have a great day.
Awesome.